There is a place in Missouri that no longer exists, not because of war, not because of earthquake or flood, though flood did come. It was erased from the map because of a decision made by one man, carried out in a rusted tank truck on a summer afternoon, watched by children playing in the dust. And by the time anyone understood what had happened, it was already far too late. This is the story of Times Beach, a town of 1,200 people, a town that trusted the wrong man with the wrong chemical at the worst possible moment in American history, a town that would become the largest civilian dioxin contamination site in the history of the United States, a town that would be bought out by the federal government, bulldozed into memory, and replaced by a state park where families now picnic on the very ground that was once declared too dangerous for human life. But before we talk about the poison, we have to talk about the place, because Times Beach was not always a ghost town. It was once, however briefly, a dream. It was 1925 when the St. Louis Star-Times newspaper launched one of the most unusual promotional campaigns in American journalism. The paper was in fierce competition for subscribers, and editors came up with a gimmick that, by the standards of the era, seemed genuinely generous. For $6 and a 6-month subscription to the paper, a reader could lease a 20 by 40-foot lot in a new resort community being developed along the Merrimack River, about 17 miles southwest of St. Louis. The place was called Times Beach, named after the paper itself. The idea was simple and appealing. City people could escape the heat and noise of St. Louis on weekends, come out to the river, breathe clean air, fish, swim, live the simple life, if only for a few days at a time. And people came. They built small summer cottages. They put up little wooden structures that were more shack than house, perched along the banks of the Merrimack. For a few years, Times Beach was exactly what the newspaper had advertised: a retreat. A quiet place at the edge of the water where urban families could pretend for a weekend that life was simpler than it was. But things changed, as they always do. The Great Depression arrived, and with it came desperation. The people who had come to Times Beach for weekends started staying permanently. The summer cottages became year-round homes. The resort community became a working-class town. Families moved in. Children were born there, schools were built, a post office was established. Times Beach became, in every meaningful sense of the word, a real place where real people lived real lives. It was never wealthy, it was never glamorous. By the 1960s and 1970s, it was a modest, struggling, blue-collar community, the kind of place that exists in the margins of every American metropolitan area. People who worked in St. Louis and couldn't afford much else. Retirees, families scraping by. The houses were small, the roads were unpaved, and that last detail, the unpaved roads, would prove to be the thing that killed the town. Unpaved roads create dust, and in the summer months when cars and trucks rolled through Times Beach, they kicked up clouds of fine Missouri dirt that settled on porches and windows and in the lungs of children playing outside. Residents had complained for years. It was a quality of life issue, an aesthetic issue, a health issue in the most basic sense. The town needed its roads treated, it needed the dust controlled, and in 1972, the city hired a man named Russell Bliss to do the job. Russell Bliss was a waste oil hauler. He collected used oil from a variety of industrial sources and then resold it for various purposes, one of which was road oiling, a common and legitimate practice of spraying oil onto unpaved roads to bind the dust and keep it down. Bliss had done this work in many places around Missouri. He had a reputation as a capable, reasonably priced contractor. No one had any reason to think twice about hiring him. What no one in Times Beach knew, what perhaps even Bliss himself did not fully understand, was the nature of the oil he was hauling. Among the industrial clients whose waste Bliss collected was a company called Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company, known as NEPACCO. This company operated a facility in Verona, Missouri, where it manufactured hexachlorophene, an antibacterial chemical used in soaps and other consumer products. The manufacturing process produced a tremendous amount of toxic waste. And mixed into that waste as a byproduct of the chemical process was a substance called 2,3,7,8-tetrachlorodibenzoyl-dioxin. Dioxin. If you have heard of dioxin, you may already understand why that word carries such weight. Dioxin is not one chemical but a family of related compounds, and the specific variant produced at the NEPACCO facility, 2,378 TCDD, is among the most toxic substances ever identified by science. It is a byproduct of certain industrial processes, including the manufacture of the herbicide Agent Orange, which the United States military had been spraying across Vietnam in enormous quantities in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Scientists were beginning in the early 1970s to understand that dioxin caused cancer, that it caused chloracne, a severe and disfiguring skin condition, that it disrupted hormones, that it caused birth defects, that it accumulated in the body and did not leave, that it was, measured in parts per trillion, catastrophically dangerous to living organisms. An EPA had a dioxin waste problem. They needed it disposed of, and Russell Bliss, who was in the waste oil business, was paid to take it away. The records suggest he was paid somewhere between 25 and 30 cents per gallon to haul the waste. He mixed it with his other waste oil. He may not have fully understood what he had. He may not have wanted to know. And then he went about his business, spraying that oil on roads and in arenas and on farm properties across Missouri. In 1971, a year before he sprayed Times Beach, Bliss treated the arena at a horse stable near Verona, Missouri called Shenandoah Stables. Within days, birds began dying. Then horses began dying. Children who had played in the arena became sick. One little girl, a child named Andrea Timp, became gravely ill with a mysterious constellation of symptoms: headaches, rashes, aches. She was 6 years old. She would recover, but her illness would eventually become one of the first clues that something was terribly, systematically wrong. By 1972, the Centers for Disease Control had begun investigating the horse deaths. Investigators found dioxin contamination in the soil at Shenandoah Stables. The trail eventually led to NEPACCO and to Russell Bliss. The EPA began monitoring. Studies were conducted. Reports were filed. The machinery of federal environmental oversight ground slowly forward. And in the meantime, Bliss drove his tank truck into Times Beach and sprayed the roads. He treated the roads of Times Beach in 1972 and again in 1973. It was a completely ordinary transaction. He was paid $2,500 for the work. The residents of Times Beach watched the truck roll through their streets, watched the oil soak into the dirt, watched the dust settle, and they were grateful. The dust problem had been solved. Children played freely in the streets. Dogs ran across the newly treated roads. The oil soaked into the ground and into the yards and into the soil beneath the houses. Nobody knew. For nearly a decade, nobody knew. Life in Times Beach continued as it had before. Children grew up. People got sick in ways that people sometimes get sick, in ways that no one connected to the roads, because why would they? The idea that your street itself was poisonous was not a thought that would occur to a reasonable person in 1974 or 1975. You did not think about what was in the road oil. You did not think about dioxin. Most people had never heard the word. But the EPA knew, or was beginning to know. By the late 1970s, the investigation of dioxin contamination sites across Missouri had expanded dramatically. Investigators identified dozens of locations where Bliss had sprayed his contaminated oil: horse arenas, farm roads, residential streets, industrial properties. The contamination was widespread. The question of what to do about it was, bureaucratically and politically, enormously complicated. And then, in November 1982, the EPA came to Times Beach. They came with soil sampling equipment and federal authority and clipboards and concerns. They tested the soil, and what they found was staggering. The dioxin levels in the soil of Times Beach were extraordinary, in some spots measured at more than 300 parts per trillion. The safety guideline that the EPA was working with at the time was 1 part per trillion. In the most contaminated areas of Times Beach, the levels were 300 times that. The entire town, the roads, the yards, the soil beneath the houses where children had played for a decade, was saturated with one of the most toxic substances known to science. The EPA had its results, and then they sat on them. Not forever, but long enough. The agency debated internally about what to do, how to communicate the findings, what the public health implications were, whether evacuation was necessary. These were not simple questions. They were questions with enormous financial and political consequences. And while the federal government debated, the residents of Times Beach had no idea that their town had been declared, in the private assessments of federal scientists, essentially uninhabitable. Then the Merrimack River answered the question for everyone. On December 2, 1982, the Merrimack flooded. It was a catastrophic flood, one of the worst the region had ever seen. The river rose and then burst its banks and inundated Times Beach entirely. Homes were flooded to their rooflines. Streets disappeared under muddy brown water. Residents grabbed what they could and fled. The town was evacuated. In the immediate aftermath of the flood, with residents displaced and wondering when they could return, the EPA made its announcement. On December 23, 1982, just 3 weeks after the flood, the agency publicly disclosed the dioxin contamination results. The timing was, to put it charitably, unfortunate. People who had just lost their homes to a flood were now being told that even if the flood had not come, their homes were poisoned. They were told not to return. They were told that Times Beach was contaminated at levels that posed a serious risk to human health. They were told, effectively, that their town was gone. The announcement created immediate panic. The story exploded into the national media. Dioxin, Times Beach, Missouri. The words became linked in the American consciousness with the kind of industrial horror that the country had been confronting haltingly and inadequately since Love Canal in 1978. But Times Beach was different in scale. It was an entire town, 1,200 people. An entire community rendered uninhabitable not by a natural disaster, but by a decision made by a man in a truck with a tank full of poison oil. The human stories that emerged from Times Beach in the months that followed were devastating. Residents who had lived there for years came forward with their medical histories: miscarriages, birth defects, cancers, immune disorders, children who had grown up playing in the streets now sick in ways that no one had ever connected to where they lived. The epidemiology was complicated and contested. It always is in these cases, because proving causation requires the kind of longitudinal data that rarely exists, and because industrial defendants and their lawyers are sophisticated and well-funded and know how to exploit scientific uncertainty. But the personal testimonies were heartbreaking and voluminous and hard to dismiss. There were mothers who had lost multiple pregnancies. There were children with learning disabilities and immune problems. There were adults with cancers unusual for their age. There were families who had watched animals sicken and die. And there were all the people who were simply well, who had lived in Times Beach for decades and never got unusually sick, which complicated the narrative but did not make the contamination less real or the underlying wrongdoing less serious. The federal government moved with unusual speed given its typical pace on environmental matters. In February 1983, the EPA announced that it would buy out the residents of Times Beach. The federal government would purchase every home in the town at pre-flood market value, relocating the 1,200 residents and taking ownership of the contaminated land. It was an extraordinary step, the United States government buying an entire town. It had happened before in rare circumstances, but never quite like this. Never quite so visibly, never with so many cameras watching, never with so much dioxin in the soil. The buyout cost approximately $36 million. Residents received checks and left. Some were grateful, some were furious. Many were simply bewildered, standing at the intersection of environmental catastrophe and personal loss, trying to understand how a town could just cease to exist. They had lived there, they had built lives there, their children had grown up there, and now they were being handed money and told to go. After the residents left, Times Beach became a federal property. The houses were demolished, the streets were closed, the town was physically erased, fences went up, signs went up warning of contamination, and for years the land simply sat there, a toxic ghost town on the banks of the Merrimack. A monument to what happens when industrial chemicals meet human indifference and regulatory failure, and the particular American habit of cleaning up messes only after they become impossible to ignore. The legal proceedings that followed were long and complicated and ultimately unsatisfying in the way that legal proceedings in these cases usually are. NEPACCO was found liable. Russell Bliss settled civil claims. Various parties paid various amounts into remediation funds. The numbers were large in the abstract and inadequate in the particular, as they always are when you are trying to put a dollar value on a community destroyed and lives irrevocably altered. The cleanup of Times Beach itself was a massive engineering undertaking. The approach chosen was incineration. A high-temperature rotary kiln incinerator was constructed on the site to burn the contaminated soil. Between 1996 and 1997, crews processed approximately 265,000 tons of dioxin-contaminated soil through the incinerator, burning it at temperatures high enough to break down the dioxin molecules. The incinerator ran day and night. The smoke was filtered, the ash was tested, and when it was done, the EPA declared that the site had been successfully remediated. Here is where the story takes one of its stranger turns. By the mid-1990s, the scientific understanding of dioxin had evolved significantly. The EPA had been working on a major reassessment of dioxin's health risks, and the emerging consensus, while still alarming, suggested that the 1 part per trillion safety standard that had been used to condemn Times Beach was perhaps more conservative than necessary. Some scientists argued that the levels found in Times Beach, while genuinely elevated, might not have posed the catastrophic immediate risk that the original announcement implied. Others maintained that the original safety standard was appropriate given what was known at the time, and given the principle of erring on the side of caution when the stakes involved children's health. The former EPA administrator who had overseen the Times Beach response, a woman named Ann Gorsuch Burford, said publicly years later that the evacuation of Times Beach had been a mistake, that the risk had been overstated, that 1,200 people had been unnecessarily uprooted. This was a remarkable and controversial statement from a figure who was herself controversial. Gorsuch Burford had resigned from the EPA in 1983, under a cloud of accusations that her agency had been too cozy with the industries it was supposed to regulate, that it had mismanaged the Superfund program, that it had prioritized industry interests over public health. The debate over whether the Times Beach response was proportionate or excessive continues among environmental scientists and public health experts. What is not debated is that the contamination was real. What is not debated is that Russell Bliss spread dioxin-contaminated oil on the streets of a residential community where children played. What is not debated is that NEPACCO produced a massive quantity of one of the most toxic substances ever created and paid to have it hauled away without adequate disclosure of what it was. The argument is about degree, not about fundamental facts. And the fundamental facts are damning enough. Consider what happened at Shenandoah Stables, which was treated by Bliss in 1971 before Times Beach. 62 horses died, birds dropped from the sky, children who played in the arena became sick. It took years for investigators to trace the cause. In the meantime, more sites were treated, more communities were exposed. The system that was supposed to protect people from industrial poison failed at every level. At the level of the company that produced the waste, at the level of the contractor who hauled and spread it, and at the level of the regulatory agencies that moved too slowly and communicated too poorly and prioritized administrative process over urgent human need. Times Beach is often discussed alongside Love Canal as one of the founding disasters of the modern American environmental movement. Love Canal, in Niagara Falls, New York, was the contaminated landfill beneath a suburban neighborhood whose story broke open in 1978 and horrified the country. The revelations at Love Canal led directly to the creation of the Superfund program in 1980, the federal mechanism by which the most contaminated industrial sites in America are identified and cleaned up, with the costs billed to the responsible parties. Times Beach became one of Superfund's most prominent early cases. Together, these disasters reshaped how Americans thought about the relationship between industrial activity and community safety. They revealed a system in which companies could produce staggering quantities of toxic waste, pay pennies per gallon to have someone else deal with it, and walk away while communities lived on top of the consequences. They revealed regulatory agencies that were chronically underfunded, chronically understaffed, and chronically vulnerable to political pressure from the industries they were supposed to oversee. They revealed a culture in which the burden of proof for harm rested on the communities being harmed, while the industries causing the harm enjoyed the presumption of innocence and the resources to maintain it. But we should not lose the human dimension in the policy analysis, because Times Beach was not a policy, it was a place, and the people who lived there were not data points, they were families. There were people who had lived in Times Beach their entire lives. Elderly residents who had built their houses with their own hands in the 1930s and 1940s, who had raised their children and buried their spouses there, who were handed a check for their contaminated property and told to find somewhere else to spend their remaining years. There were young families who had moved to Times Beach because it was what they could afford, who had been saving to move to better neighborhoods, who now found themselves displaced and traumatized and sick with a worry that would never fully leave them. The question of whether what happened to their health or their children's health was connected to the years they had spent in that poison place. There were children, and this is perhaps the most difficult thing to sit with, there were children who had grown up playing in those streets, who had run through those yards, who had breathed the dust kicked up by passing cars on roads treated with Russell Bliss's oil. Those children are adults now in their 40s and 50s. Some of them have had cancers, some have had reproductive problems, some are healthy. All of them carry with them the knowledge of what was done to them, in a town that no longer exists in a time before anyone knew to warn them. The question of what dioxin specifically did to the health of Times Beach residents remains scientifically unresolved in the detailed, granular way that such questions always remain unresolved. Epidemiological studies of Times Beach residents conducted in the years after the evacuation produced mixed and inconclusive results. Some studies found elevated rates of certain health problems. Others did not find statistically significant differences from control populations. The science of low-level chronic dioxin exposure is genuinely complicated. And the honest answer is that we do not know, with the precision that courtrooms and headlines demand, exactly how much damage was done to exactly how many people. But we know damage was done. We know because of the studies at Seveso, Italy, where a 1976 industrial explosion released a massive cloud of dioxin over a residential area. We know because of the veterans exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam. whose health problems, cancers, neuropathy, reproductive harm were documented over decades of study. We know because of what happened to the horses and birds at Shenandoah stables. Dioxin does terrible things to living organisms. The people of Times Beach were exposed to it for years. The precise accounting of the harm may never be complete, but the harm itself is not in doubt. After the cleanup was finished, after the incinerator had done its work and the soil had been tested and declared acceptable, the state of Missouri made a decision that is either inspiring or deeply strange depending on your perspective. They turned Times Beach into a state park. Route 66 State Park opened on the site of Times Beach in 1999. Today, families picnic there, children play there, people walk their dogs along the Merrimack River on trails that run through what was once a neighborhood. The visitor center is housed in a building that dates to the Times Beach era. It was once the Bridgehead Inn, a roadhouse that served travelers on old Route 66 which runs through the area. Inside the visitor center there are exhibits about the history of Route 66, that great American road, and there are exhibits about the history of Times Beach itself, the contamination, the evacuation, the cleanup. It is, in a way, an act of honesty. The park does not pretend the town never existed. It tells the story, it preserves the memory, and it makes the argument implicit in its very existence that the land has been healed, that the cleanup worked, that the poison has been burned away and the site returned to safety. Whether you find that reassuring or insufficient probably depends on how closely you read the history. There is one more figure in this story who deserves attention, and that is Russell Bliss himself. Bliss was never criminally charged in connection with the Times Beach contamination. He faced civil liability and paid settlements. He maintained for years that he had not known the full nature of what he was hauling, that he had been a victim of inadequate disclosure from any PACCO, that he had been a middleman caught between an industrial producer and an uninformed public. There is some truth in that framing, and there is also convenient truth in it. The records suggest that Bliss had received warnings as early as 1971, after the Shenandoah stables disaster, that his oil might be contaminated. He continued spraying. He continued collecting waste from any PACCO. The full extent of his knowledge and his culpability was contested for years, and was never definitively adjudicated in the way that might have provided the residents of Times Beach with the clean legal vindication they deserved. Any PACCO was found liable under Superfund law, and its officers faced legal consequences. The company itself had essentially been wound down by the time the full extent of the contamination became clear. The money available for cleanup and compensation was, as is typical in these cases, far less than the actual cost of what was done. What happened at Times Beach is not an aberration. That is perhaps the most important and most uncomfortable thing to understand about this story. Times Beach is not a freak accident, an isolated failure, a unique convergence of bad luck and bad actors. It is an example of a systemic problem that existed throughout American industrial history, and that has not been fully solved. The production of toxic waste is an inherent byproduct of certain industrial processes. The disposal of that waste costs money. The incentive to cut corners on disposal costs is enormous. The regulatory oversight of waste disposal has historically been inadequate, captured by industry interests, and underfunded by political choice. The communities that bear the consequences of these decisions are almost always poor communities, working-class communities, communities without the political power to protect themselves. Times Beach was a poor town. The residents were not wealthy, they were not politically connected, they did not have environmental lawyers on retainer. They had 1,200 people on unpaved streets asking their town to do something about the dust, and the town hired the cheapest contractor available. That is the story in miniature. That is how these disasters happen. Not through dramatic villainy, but through the ordinary, grinding operation of a system that does not adequately protect the people at the bottom of it. The legacy of Times Beach lives in the Superfund program, which for all its limitations and failures has cleaned up hundreds of the most contaminated sites in America. It lives in the tightening of dioxin regulations that followed the Times Beach revelations. It lives in the increased attention to environmental justice that disasters like Times Beach helped generate. It lives in the work of advocates and scientists and journalists who refuse to let the story be buried under administrative jargon and legal settlements. And it lives in the people who carry it. The former residents of Times Beach, the people who were children there and the people who raised those children, the people who were sick and the people who wondered for decades whether they would become sick. They carry the knowledge of what was done to them in a quiet Missouri town on the banks of the Merrimack River in the summer of 1972, when a man in a truck made a decision that would end their world. The dust was controlled, the roads were settled, the children went out to play. And no one knew. That is the darkest thing about Times Beach. Not the dioxin, not the government failure, not the corporate indifference. The darkest thing is the innocence of it, the absolute ordinary innocence of a town trying to solve a dust problem on a summer afternoon. The children did not know they were playing in poison. Their parents did not know. The contractors did not tell them. The regulators did not warn them. The system that was supposed to exist to protect them did not protect them. And by the time anyone understood what had happened, the children had already grown up. The poison was already in the soil. The town was already dying, it just did not know it yet. Route 66 State Park is a beautiful place by most accounts. The Merrimack River runs clear and cold through it. There are hiking trails and fishing spots and picnic areas. Families come on weekends. Dogs run along the river. Children play in the grass. On the ground beneath their feet, 60 feet down in some places, there is the memory of a town. There are the ghost foundations of small houses, the shadow lines of streets, the archaeological record of 1,200 lives lived in a place that the world decided was too poisoned to continue. The cleanup removed the contaminated topsoil. The incinerator burned it. The remediation was declared complete. But memory does not incinerate. Memory persists. And the story of Times Beach, of a town that trusted and was betrayed, of a country that produced poison and paid pennies to make it disappear, of children who played in streets made lethal by adult indifference, that story does not burn away. It is there in the grass. It is there in the river. It is there in the faces of the people who grew up breathing that dust, who still wake up sometimes and wonder and will wonder for the rest of their lives. Times Beach, Missouri, population 1,200, established 1925, erased 1983, cleaned up 1997, now a park. Now a memory. Now a warning that the country has not finished heating.